Hermeticism 2.0, Terragnosis, and what might that look like? That's our topic for today. It's been said that we live in an age of anxiety or an age of spiritual vacuum, meaninglessness, many different terms for it. I suppose they're all true. And of course, a big part of this is that there have been, for a long time now, for centuries now, and this is ongoing, attempts to colonize pagans and heathens and indigenous practices out of existence. The Druids were destroyed by the Romans. A lot of pagan practices were destroyed by Christian armies and missionaries. And all of this too leaves a spiritual vacuum, particularly for those of us who do not find a home in the big religions. So as a result, spiritual seekers take whatever they can get. They might drift into what's been known as the New Age, although they usually don't call themselves New Agers anymore. They might get some kind of training or attend workshops to become shamans, which is, of course, a very popular thing here in California, in spite of the rather questionable sources of that, a lot of that training. And people often are hungry for something that could serve as some sort of a path, but they aren't quite sure where to go, which is understandable. All of this is. So do we need a new big story, as Thomas Berry suggests, one that can hold collective meaning for most of us or all of us? Do we need a new mythology? Do we need a new religion? And I would submit that the answer to all those questions is no. But we might find a wisdom path useful, maybe. So as far as the new big story goes, the problem with big stories, and Barry makes the point that for a lot of people, Christianity was a big story for a long time, a story that told us where we are in the cosmos and who we are to each other and to ourselves. The problem with those is the colonization I mentioned before. The big stories tend to become dogmas. They tend to become rigid. And there's always people that the big stories don't work for. And what do they have? What's for them, right? Mythology, even in Joseph Campbell's opinion, is a bunch of scattered remnants compared to what it was previously. When before there were relatively isolated communities, they could come up with their own pantheons or mystical worldviews relatively untouched, although human cultural diffusion and mixing go on all the way back to the beginning, probably. But that time has long passed. We're much more connected across the globe than we were previously. And, the myth, in terms of its usual meaning of being an oral telling that works for a group of people for a while, they resonate to it, and then they build institutions around it and doctrines and things like that. Religions get started like this. It raises that whole question of, well, what would the new myths look like, and how do we know what one is? If myth takes centuries to actually become kind of certified traditionally as a myth, what's for us now? There's all kinds of problems with that. And then with religion too, I mean, if you look at Pew polls, for instance, here in the States and in Western Europe, there's growing numbers of people who don't consider themselves members of religion, but they do consider themselves spiritual or spiritual seekers. So what's for them? And then there's people who don't consider themselves either religious or spiritual, and they would just like a philosophical path, not philosophy in the sense of big abstract systems, but just basic orientation. What am I doing here, and where do I go? And what are some useful tools that are not just about thinking, which Western white philosophy tends to focus on, but in other cultures like the Akan, the Chinese, many cultures around the world, Aboriginal, Australian, philosophy isn't just about battering concepts around. It's embodied. What do we do to live a good life? Those kinds of questions. So we know from Hermeticism that 1.0, the original version of Hermeticism, included a lot under its very diverse umbrella. A lot of things: Gnosticism, alchemy, divination, dream studies, astrology, herbs, and plant medicine, ritual, storytelling, writing down, and interpreting sacred lore. It led to Renaissance natural magic and was influential on the Renaissance itself. A number of key Renaissance people like Da Vinci were hermetically inclined. It led to Islamic Gnosticism and Sufism, European Romanticism, spiritual ecology, as we would call it nowadays, depth psychology, particularly the Jungian branch. It's fair to say that Jungian psychology is basically updated Hermeticism and Romanticism. And more recently, terrapsychology, the study of how the things of the world, not only landscapes and rivers, but neighborhoods and automobiles and even everyday objects, get into the psyche and move around, and how our inner motions of mood and fantasy and dream accurately reflect events in the outer world. So that too, terrapsychology too, has been heavily influenced by Hermeticism. Mostly indirectly, mostly without our knowledge. And then those of us who do terrapsychology, like me, who gave it the name, when we went looking in Hermeticism, we went, wow, these are amazing parallels. This obviously influenced us. So what I'm leading to for this video is I wish to explore, and I'm doing doctoral work on this right now, how an updated Hermeticism for our time might serve as an earth-honoring, cosmos-honoring wisdom path that fosters an enchanted relationship with ourselves, with each other, our planet, the locations where we live, nature, the elements, and the cosmos. What might that look like? The name I have given to this, to my version of this, is Terragnosis, Hermeticism 2.0. And I think of Terragnosis as a wisdom path, and it can be used as a spiritual path as well, that goes forth from depth psychology's innovation of Hermeticism, terrapsychology, spiritual ecology, into a wisdom path and spiritual path without bishops, bulls, or big books. It's no authority. There's no authority in this. It's investigation, as Hermeticism always has been. And that word terra, which of course is the Roman name for earth, not only for the planet itself, but terra held symbolically and experientially as here, terra as place, body, location. And gnosis, as we've talked about previously in these videos, for eco-wisdom, for direct knowledge of the kind that's available and continuous communion with the cosmos, with the intelligence of the animated cosmos. That's how I would describe and define Terragnosis. So, long before there were churches or temples or mosques, people always found inspiration and rejuvenation in their natural surroundings. And even after the temples and the churches and the mosques, monks in the Himalayas and Christians in the wilderness, the key spiritual masters like Jesus, Moses, Mahavira, the Buddha, a number of them, Muhammad, all drawing strength from the world of nature, all located somewhere in nature when they have their key revelations. So for Terragnosis, the house of reverent gathering is the world. The sacred lives inside, to be sure, but it also lives outside and all around us. Its roots in Hermetic and Egyptian tradition span cultures and were old before cities arose. The roots of Hermeticism reach back before empires and religions. Symbols swimming in the imagination open doors from the Hermetic perspective into a holy world that interpenetrates the one our senses record. For Terragnosis, our way of acquiring knowledge is deeply participatory and animistic. Its ethic is, I've mentioned this in a previous video, the fivefold caring, including caring for ourselves and each other. So the ethics that come down to us from Hermeticism also belong in updated version in Terragnosis as well. The moods of Terragnosis, as I imagine it, are devotion, awe, love, respect, play, and homecoming. And their practices, which I'll get into in a moment, are reflective and embodied. So cosmologically, Terragnosis links the soul of the self with the soul of the self of everything. And our sense that the cosmos is a place of great beauty and wonder really begins on Earth. It's Earth where we stand. And so it's Earth that's preeminent for us. And I think back to that term anima terrae, Kepler's term, Kepler the scientist, anima terrae, the soul of Earth. And also this in communication with the soul of the cosmos, the anima mundi. So Terragnosis, as I understand it, would be an integral endeavor. And by integral, I mean that it supports scientific discovery, but it rejects scientism as an ideology, reductive materialistic scientism. It accepts religion, but only insofar as it transcends dogmatic intolerance. And the natural world prizes and designs for variety, and we should too. So a key aspect of Terragnosis is diversity and the equity and justice that should go with it. Keep in mind that Hermeticism has counterparts all over the world. So should Terragnosis, its update. In terms of a daily practice, or set of practices rather, what would this look like? So these are just a few examples of things I'm involved in, and you'll probably come up with your own if you're interested in this, but they center on continual conscious conversation with, of course, our interiority, ourselves, our moods, responses, thoughts, feelings, health, illness, being fully present to ourselves, the unconscious, as depth psychology has described it, through dream work and active imagination, the practice that Jung was inspired to create from Gnosticism, looking deeply into somatic states and reading them symbolically, our whole fantasy life, and the kinds of imagination that the Romantic poets and philosophers told us so much about, including Coleridge and Novalis and others. A conversation that's ongoing with each other, speaking and listening from the heart, watching our projections, and using imagination to empathize with each other and respond. Conversations with sacred places that announce themselves as such, whether they're grasslands, grottos, or glaciers. And of course, also conversation with the world itself, the lands and the waters and the elements and the skies and the winds and the weathers and the cycles. And even matter, even inanimate objects, our everyday things that we own, and that sometimes, unfortunately, own us. So I like the way the old alchemist and physician Paracelsus put it. He said, the body of man, and pardon the gendered language, resembles the earth. It is fruitful in summer and unfruitful in winter. So are we. When we live more according to natural cycles, we really feel that way. I find that with myself. I deliberately slow down in the winter because that's how it should be. And I speed up when the spring comes. So Earth speaks in many ways. And while some people think that a large tornado touching down on World Environment Day is just coincidence, we might discern, if we want to be playful and fanciful about it, a gesture or an earthly message of some kind. And I really like how Alice Walker puts it in her essays, Living by the Word. She says that when she delights in the wildflowers that visit her yard, even more appear next season. That's what I mean by conversation. So 2.0 versus 1.0, what are the updates that are needed? Well, one, of course, is language. The language that was in use centuries ago no longer really works. And so we need to be able to update that to some extent. We should keep the best translations we have of the Hermetica, but we shouldn't be afraid to add to it and modify it as well. So the gendered language in particular, which I've mentioned several times in these videos, Hermeticists use terms like father and son, and they do it consciously metaphorically rather than literally. But one of the things that feminism has taught us is that even as metaphors, gendered words matter. We can be more inclusive than that. And the imagery and the mythology of Hermeticism tends to melt unworkable binaries. We should go with that. We should extend that. 2.0 would promote social justice, equity, and diversity, a program of fairness and compassion that really is inherent to both Hermeticism's ethical conduct and its delight in earthly and cosmic variation. 2.0 would support animal rights. The original Hermeticists were vegetarians, and as I've mentioned before, they would definitely be vegans now. So I don't think walking this path is a matter of should I be or shouldn't I be. I think it begins with reflection on where our food comes from, and then we can go where our heart leads us. I think the updates would clarify the distinction between science, a set of exploratory and verificational skills and disciplines, and scientism, which is an absolutist materialist ideology. Hermeticism supports the first, but not the second. And I think we should continue the Hermeticist refusal to split earth from sky and spirit from nature, although there is some nature spirit splitting in some Hermetic texts. It's all nature. But at the same time, the nature down here on earth, so to speak, is an urgent peril, and so are we. And because humans in the Hermetic view are both material and spiritual, we're responsible for tending not only heavenly, but earthly matters too. And we need to take our responsibility seriously. So earth reverence has to fortify earth protection, and the sooner the better. As with the original Hermeticism, we lead with wonder, shaming people for not doing what we want them to do just arouses resentment and opposition. I think that Hermeticism's inward turn can encourage us to manage our own anger. For instance, instead of self-righteously splashing others with it and expecting them to somehow get the message. This is a lesson I think that activists could learn, some activists, especially the ones who are into shaming and guilt tripping. And I would accent the Hermeticist emphasis on appreciation, beauty, and mystery, while leaving behind the religiously regressive demand for belief in a literal deity, which never was part of Hermeticism, but certainly is part of the world religions. I think of Hermeticism as post-belief. Spirituality and wisdom and walking a wisdom path don't require belief. They require open-heartedness and mental acuity and deep reflection and a number of other qualities, imagination. Gnosis is not about belief. It's about presence, experience, and active faith that the cosmos intelligently self-organizes. And so a good many people who consider themselves even atheist or agnostic deeply may enjoy what others of us would call spiritual states of consciousness, but they don't always feel welcome saying so. I think a post-belief path would help a lot. 2.0, at least in my imaginings, would tend astrological symbols, as metaphors, not as facts, not as literal, Mars makes people angry, Venus makes them loving. From the Hermetist perspective, astrology involves relationships that are too complex to be served by either literalism or fatalism. Astrology can be tended, and in some circles is tended, much more imaginatively than degrading it into fortune telling, and the same for magic. We can also, with an updated Hermeticism, reimagine animism as a kind of animate presence, There's lots of ways of holding this. When Hermeticism says that the world is ensouled and that matter is intelligent, of course they don't mean that my glasses are thinking. What they describe is really an experiential truth that's available to anyone who's willing to play with the transition from a world of dead objects to one of living presences that interact with us continually. And by the way, animism has a very long tradition, not just in indigenous communities and other corners of the world, but in the West as well. Among philosophers, among scientists, among writers, among poets, among naturalists. For Hermeticism 2.0, I think we would be asked to disidentify, to be able to disidentify with archetypes. There's a word that Lionel Corbett, the Jungian analyst, coined, and he mentions it in his book, The Religious Function of the Psyche, trans-archetypal. And he means by this free states of consciousness that are not dominated by particular archetypes or gods, to say it in James Hillman's language. And so Hermeticism and Gnosticism both diagnose states of what we would now call archetypal possession as having fallen under the sway of archontic forces. Seeing the Saturn or Mercury or any other archetype at work in your mood or your value or your viewpoint is very valuable, but it also sublates their intensity. It integrates their intensity and diminishes it and helps one disidentify with those big figures. So inner liberation is really one reason for cultivating the gnosis of undomesticatable nous, our tie to the divine. And then we should, and this has been done to some extent, go on tracing Hermeticism's influences in contemporary culture, including fiction and fantasy. Sometimes the influences are unconscious. I doubt anybody pulled "Nothing Unreal Exists" from the Corpus Hermeticum, which is where it comes from, and put it in the mouth of a Vulcan philosopher in the universe of Star Trek, but the statement is still Hermeticist. And so is the idea of IDIC, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. And a last suggestion, and I shouldn't say last because everyone's going to have their own list for how to update Hermeticism. Tell the tales onward. The literature of classical Hermeticism is quite large if we include the alchemical work and art. We know a lot has vanished, but we have a lot. And that I don't think needs to deter us. What remains can inspire us into a new kind of storytelling and ritual, art and music, theater and thought, film and performance, and access all of it through all creative nous. So we can move the stories onward. So this leaves me here toward the end with a few remaining questions, and doubtless I'll have more, as you probably will. How might we experiment with Hermeticism as a post-belief eco-spirituality or eco-philosophy, if you don't like the word spirituality, emphasizing storytelling in the widest sense, not just narrative, but the arts, movement, film, and so on. And how might it inform ecotherapy and ritual practices and playful imaginative experiments in novel forms of culture? What might the Hermetic community of today be like? How do developments in Hermeticism parallel those in other hermeneutic paths around the world, like diaspora Ifa? I've mentioned Taoist alchemy, certain aspects of Shinto, eco-conscious Sufism, earth-honoring Vedanta, and others. What could Hermetic science be like now? And how integral can it really be? Could a Hermetic wisdom path of contemporary conscious living survive its own success, its own popularity even, without being dumbed down and commodified? Remember, unregulated capitalism is that system which is best at turning everything into more of itself, right? How might updated Hermeticism, or Terragnosis in my sense, replace doctrine and the need for myth with a lorology, as I would put it, of enjoyable fiction. So those are questions I have. There will be more, but I'll leave you with a quotation that I particularly love. If I've taught you, you've probably heard me say it before. It's from Annie Dillard, Teaching a Stone to Talk, that I think gets at where at least my version of Hermeticism 2.0, Terragnosis, wants to go. So in Teaching a Stone to Talk, she said, in the deeps are the violence and terror of which psychology has warned us. But if you drop these monsters deeper down, if you drop with them farther over the rim, the world's rim, you find what our sciences cannot locate or name: the substrate, the ocean or matrix or ether that buoys up all the rest, that gives goodness its power for good and evil its power for evil. The unified field of our complex and inexplicable caring for each other and for our life together here. This is given, it is not learned.